Hello and welcome to Unstressed. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. It is actually a story of our Indigenous forefathers who have been connected with Australia for up to 120,000 years. That is mind-boggling, and we have just so much to learn from that history, which has been largely ignored over the last 200 odd years, but it is changing, and we hope to be part of that change and champion that as well. Well, I digress. But today, the podcast is focused on something that we are all exposed to all the time. And like chemicals in our environment, it all seems rather overwhelming until you realise that you actually do have control over the problem. And in fact, by making informed decisions on the chemical front, you can reduce your exposure to chemicals by up to 80 or 90%. Today's topic is EMF, electromagnetic frequency, or EMR, electromagnetic radiation, but it is surrounding us. It's in Wi-Fi, it's in Bluetooth, it is in many of the devices that are in our homes and in our workplaces, and we are literally bathed in it. So it can seem an overwhelming topic, but today we are going to talk to Amie Skilton. Now, Amie returns to the show, and I have listened to Amie lecture at various conferences that I've attended over the years, and she is just a great educator, and she is so clear and so concise in so many of her presentations, and I wanted to share this particular one with you today. Amie is a naturopath who is also a great educator, as I've said, and today I'm discussing with her the EMF or EMR radiation in the home and how to take control of it. So I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Amie Skilton. Welcome back to the show, Amie.
Thank you, Ron. It's so good to be here.
Amie, last time you were on, we talked about the home. We talked about some of the challenges in our own home, in the built environment, and you shared with us a really incredible story in your own journey about molds and mycotoxins. But today we wanted to touch on EMF radiation. And I wondered if you might just give us a little bit of an overview of what that means and, you know, what we're actually exposed to.
Yes, absolutely. So EMFs is a really big subject. And I think whenever we start talking about EMFs, people already jump to, oh, EMFs are bad. So I just want to say there are lots of natural kinds of EMFs as well, which are really important for human health. And these are, generated fields from the universe, from the solar system that we're in, and of course, the magnetic field of the Earth itself. And those EMFs are really subtle, very low frequency, and things that our genetics have evolved with over millennia and also need for health, actually. So I just want to be really clear about that not all EMFs are the same. That being said, man-made technology is also a huge source of non-native or man-made EMFs that are very different to what human bodies and in fact all biological life on the planet is familiar with or is going to benefit from. So the distinction there is man-made EMFs are problematic. And they're problematic for a number of reasons. The nature of them, the way that they influence our biology, but also the rate at which they are increasing. And to give you some perspective on that, in the last 100 years, our exposure to man-made EMFs has increased a quintillion fold. Now,
quintillion. Wow.
Quintillion,
okay.
which if you put 18 zeros after the number 1, that's what a quintillion is.
Wow.
It's an awful lot.
Wow. So this is quite an experiment we're all conducting here, isn't it?
It is. And what makes it really challenging is EMFs are not visible. Unless you have become sensitized to them, you can't really feel them, at least not in the short term. And so if you were to say, for instance, use the example of if pollution had increased a quintillion fold and you could see the smog, I mean, you'd be right on that long before it got that out of control. But without the kind of meters that we use to measure EMFs, you don't know that they're there. And you go about your business thinking everything is fine, and also that we wouldn't be exposed to these things if they were unsafe. But unfortunately, that's not the case.
It's interesting to put a figure on it like that, because we have been exposed to pollutants in the summer of, what was it, last summer, not the summer just past, when we had bushfires. And there's a thing called the Air Quality Index, which says anything under 30 is okay. But, in parts of Sydney, it was shocking, and it got up to about 1,000. Well, 10 times 30 is 300, 100 times 30 is 3,000. So that was, that was shocking, even only 100 times more. And yet here we are a quintillion times more. I mean, that's kind of mind-boggling, but do go on.
Mm-hmm. I know, it's a very terrifying way to start the conversation.
It is. Go on, but it's got our attention.
This is what makes it so challenging, is how you assess that. The other issue with it is, whilst we have, using the air quality index as an example, we have limits which we understand to be problematic for human health. The standards that the industry use to, set guidelines around EMF exposure are not based on health. And this is where we run into some significant issues, whereby you might measure, say, the radiation coming from the cell phone tower, and it may be within industry standards, but those standards are not health-based. And
what are they based on?
A completely arbitrary figure that has been agreed upon based on the industries guiding the government.
Right. Okay, so we're self-regulating here.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And not with the public's interest in mind.
Right. So what could possibly go wrong with that? I mean, what could possibly go wrong with that? Yeah, do go on.
So as a result, when we're measuring these things, a building biologist or an electromagnetic field testing technician uses a very different set of guidelines to advise someone to change things in their home. And so that the measurements that they use and the standards that they're making recommendations are based on the evidence in the literature according to health problems that can be induced. And therein lies, a huge disparity in terms of what people think is safe, because you believe when you're buying, say, a modem off the shelf, or, the latest cell phone from the store you get it from, that it's been tested and found to be safe for human use, when in fact the framework that it's being tested against has absolutely nothing to do with human biology or the health effects that device might cause. And so the whole world of building biology, of course, is raising awareness around the health hazards found in the home. And the world of EMFs is very specific around the different types of man-made EMFs that people are being exposed to and just don't know about.
Well, we're surrounded by it. I mean, I'm sitting in my office at home and I've got my mitometer here, which, I could be measuring, and I don't even want to switch it on at the moment because it'll be too confronting. But what are some of the EMF radiations that we're exposed to within our own home?
Well, this is the thing. Many people are concerned about cell phone towers, and rightly so, living near substations, and of course the introduction of a new kind of wireless radiation, that's 5G. And we'll definitely talk about that today. But in our own homes, we're being exposed generally to much higher levels from the things that we've purchased and installed in our home. And for most people, that will be their cell phones. That will likely be the number one source of of radiation, but their wireless modem or any smart devices and wireless headphones are other really significant sources of exposure.
I know that, for example, the earbuds, I mean, you and I both got our little corded headphones on, but I see people walking around with earbuds. You know, what do they call? Is that what they're actually called? You know what I'm talking about.
I know exactly.
You can just touch them and the volume will go up, or, you know, whatever. And I've actually have used my mitometer to measure that. It's a little bit concerning.
It's very concerning. In fact, you know, anything that runs off Bluetooth or is wireless is going to produce sometimes up to 17 times more radiation than a cell phone. And we know that cell phones are not designed to be held to your head and spoken on like that. The only testing that's been done has used them for a 6-minute increment on a plastic dummy head. And so the wireless headphones, I think, are arguably, next to the cell phone, the most significant issue that people are going to have. Also because people tend to wander around with them in their ears even when they're not in use. And so, you know, if you work in an office environment, like let's say in a call center, you're in customer service, you might just keep that wireless headphone in for ease of use. So you can get up and make a cup of tea, or just click the button when a call comes through. Or like I see a lot of people doing with their own personal cell phones, they'll use those earbuds and just leave them in, maybe listening to music when they're not on a call. But the thing is, those wireless devices are constantly seeking a signal. And so it's just like talking with your cell phone to your head, you know, for 8 hours a day, however long you're wearing them for. So they are arguably even more problematic than your mobile phone.
And you mentioned that it's self-regulated and the industry is reassuringly looking after, I would like to think, our interests, but I have a feeling they may be looking after their interests. Surely some research has been done on this, and I know Europe tends to be a little more, shall we say, precautionary about this. What's some of the research telling us?
So there is a huge body of evidence now on various types of man-made EMFs, but in particular the wireless radiation, so from communication devices, including cell phones, modems, and even things like radar, for example. There's a lot of research that's come out of the military on, you know, radar sickness syndrome. And what it is, it's not a lack of evidence anymore. It's competing financial interests that are getting in the way of standards being adjusted. Even the governing bodies in Australia acknowledge that the standards are insufficient for children, elderly, and people with chronic illness. But they have also avoided for the last 21, 22 years bothering to update their standards. And so it's unfortunate that, you know, when you look at the different standards across the world, you're absolutely right. Many European countries and even China have standards that are 1,000 times stricter than we do have here in Australia, which is surprising. But what that means is it's going to take people becoming educated and modifying their own behaviours to lower their exposure, because there is no regulatory or governing body that's going to come in and do that for you, unfortunately.
I think it's quite confronting when people realise, and I think this occurred in 2011 or 13, that WHO classified Wi-Fi radiation as a class 2B carcinogen. That is, it possibly could cause. It's like class 1 is definite carcinogen, class 2A is probable carcinogen, and class 2B is possible carcinogen. So that's pretty confronting, isn't it?
It is, because if there wasn't evidence for its cancer-causing properties, it wouldn't be sitting as a class 2B. So what that means is the World Health Organization have seen evidence that it can cause cancer. And herein lies the thing, right? You know, we have sort of roughly 2 categories of radiation. And I think when most people hear the term radiation, they think of ionizing radiation. They think of nuclear power, Chernobyl, X-rays. And, you know, there was a time where that wasn't understood to be cancer causing either. They used to X-ray children's feet to get, you know, the right shoes. It was a bit of a marketing tactic, but anyway, they did that anyway. And these days, you would know better than anyone as a dentist, if you've got to perform an X-ray, you stand behind a lead-lined wall to make sure you don't get exposed. You don't order X-rays without, you know, seriously weighing up the risks versus benefits to the patient. And so we now understand ionizing radiation to be a significant factor in DNA damage. And that's because the energy of those waves is so high, it causes instant DNA damage. However, because it's such an extreme presentation of high energy radiation, the lower energy radiation or non-ionizing radiation has been incorrectly lumped into not harmful category. But what we do know now is that non-ionizing radiation does cause DNA damage. It causes single and double-stranded DNA breaks. And there's also a number of other biological mechanisms whereby it causes harm to human cells and, in fact, all living cells, including mold, by the way. We can touch on that later, but we know that the damage takes longer to occur. It's not as instant and it's cumulative. And I suppose the good news out of that is that the sooner we modify our behavior, the sooner we can remove or reduce that exposure overall to our own cellular health. But if you look at the ORSA database, which is orsaa.org,
Yes.
they've done a lot of hard work at really bringing together all of the evidence around EMFs and predominantly non-ionizing radiation. And what's really interesting is, as with all studies, you want to look at who's funding the study. If you look at I think it's roughly 2,500 studies that they've categorized there that show no harmful effects on man-made EMFs. Every single one of them, except for one, has been funded by a telco company, which of course have a vested interest in having that outcome occur. And that one paper that you just don't know who actually funds it. So I'd be willing to bet money it was a telco. Whereas the other ones where they don't have a financial interest in the outcome being a certain way, we start to see a more realistic picture of the outcome. But unfortunately, it's like any toxicology studies. You're looking at single doses in controlled environments for a finite amount of time. And here's how I want to, I guess, compare it. It's a little bit like studying someone who smokes cigarettes for a week or a month. And then you're like, oh, well, you know, the lung damage wasn't really that bad and it resolved in a week or two and they never got lung cancer. Therefore, cigarettes aren't really that harmful and you won't get lung cancer. There is a latency period, just like with asbestos and cigarettes and other toxins, whereby it's that cumulative nature over time that has the impact. And then in the real-time environment, you know, you can study a cell phone in a lab, which they've never done, by the way, on a real human body. It's a plastic dummy, which is called SAM. And but you know, if you look at a normal office, a corporate office in a major city, you've got 30 to 50 people sitting on that floor, all with at least one cell phone, probably some wireless headphones, probably some Wi-Fi modems, along with wireless printers. And very quickly, you are swimming in a sea of radiation that you can't visibly pick up, but your cells absolutely do. And herein lies the problem, along with, you know, everything else in a major city as well that runs on wireless. So you can see very quickly how exposure gets out of control, and over years and decades can lead to some pretty significant health issues.
I mean, this has raised an issue of evidence-based medicine or marketing. The words are almost interchangeable in our world, and unfortunately, it's a story that is very easy to miss, even for busy health practitioners. And in fact, one could even argue particularly for busy health practitioners.
Yeah.
But once you hear it, very difficult to ignore. And it's it's a theme that I've explored in my book and in this podcast many times and will continue to do. But it's interesting you raising this issue about so many studies, an avalanche almost of studies are done by the companies themselves, in this case telcos, in other cases pharmaceutical companies, and that floods the medical research. And so I don't think research is weighted according to who funds it. So it then goes into a pool, which when somebody does a meta-analysis, it goes, well, look, there have been 3,000 studies done, and really 2/3 of them or more, 75%, show there are no effect. And that's a meta-analysis. That's really what goes on in research, doesn't it?
It's a real shame. There's no perfect formula to working things out. And of course, once you know how the system works, you can easily influence it. And this is exactly what's happening. And when you're making a lot of money from something, of course, you're going to reinvest in, producing evidence to ensure that nothing threatens, the golden goose. And so this is what makes it really difficult, I think, for people to feel, I guess, confident in questioning the status quo. I think many of us are conditioned to believe that if it was unsafe, it wouldn't be on our supermarket shelves or on Bunnings shelves or in retail stores. And that just simply isn't the case. And then it can become overwhelming, and trying to navigate that is difficult. And then there seems to be, it's becoming more and more of a thing. There's like this arrogance around what position you choose to take, and people, there's a real payoff. There's a cheap and tawdry payoff about being right, and people will fight to the death to defend their position. And that becomes more important to them to actually uncovering the truth, or even accepting or realizing that maybe it's a very terribly grey area, and that maybe the precautionary principle is best applied here until we know more. And if you're not trained in how to read research, and even if you are, it can take a lot of digging to really get to the core of it, because often people will misrepresent their conclusions. I'm sure you've read many, an abstract and title, only to dive into the paper and find that actually that was a total red herring.
Yes.
And so it's easy if you just looking on PubMed as a member of the general public to look at an abstract and draw a conclusion and not actually be able to witness the methodology being flawed or the conclusion actually not supported by the raw data. And so, a lot of people also, I think, just feel more comfortable believing that the government will do the right thing by us and the World Health Organization. And so we'll just parrot what is published online and leave it there. The other thing too is technology is really fun. It opens up a whole new world. It's also very addictive, and no one likes to have their vices threatened. And so, you point to alcohol, you point to coffee. People will fly, the flag of a study that showed it was beneficial for heart disease or diabetes, and leave me alone with my glass of Shiraz, thank you very much. And I can't tell you, the most controversial, or I guess the most triggering post I've ever done was on wireless headphones, because everyone thinks they're super cool with these little earbuds in their heads. It's like it's a status symbol. I get it. I'm an Apple fan. I love technology, and no one wants to believe that these, this status symbol of cool is actually really problematic. And so people will cling very tightly to whatever evidence they can find that something is not a problem. The other thing is, of course, this, for some weird reason, has ended up in the basket where, the full basket of cognitive dissonance, where everything ends up defaulting to you're a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist. And so that sort of stops a lot of people from looking further into it, because no one wants to be labeled as a nutter, or as someone who's, unscientific or unhinged or not based in reality. And so for many people, they get bullied or shamed or frightened out of even looking and just are willing to accept. And I really think this is one of those things, especially with the rollout of 5G, that has really triggered two camps when it comes to wireless radiation, which is just such a shame.
Mm. Yes, no, you can open a whole minefield here by just questioning, gee, I wonder if 5G is okay. Oh my God, are you one of those? Mm-hmm. Are you one of those nutters? I'm sorry. No, I'm totally for 5G. Just give me anything. No. Well, anyway, look, the purpose of this podcast is actually to empower people to take control, because I think we could get very frustrated about the fact that regulations aren't coming from above. And by above, I'm not talking about God. I'm talking about, in fact, we may have a better chance of getting it from God than we will from government. But having said that, this is about knowledge, empowering us to make decisions while still enjoying our technology. And I think we're both in the same boat there. We both love it. Everybody does. So we need to work out what is best way to go. You mentioned ionizing radiation, and if we don't have to think of, the electromagnetic spectrum is a spectrum, and down one end are those really destructive ionizing radiations, and down the other end are radiation that we've been dealing with for the last 100 years, radio waves and then television and all of that. And then we've got the visible light range, and then, that acronym I think of Roigabiv. It's not really an acronym, but it's red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Mm-hmm. And when we go beyond violet, it's called ultraviolet, and that's still non-ionizing.
It's actually right on the cusp of ionizing and non-ionizing. And so it's difficult, like when we try and categorize things, it's for our own benefit, right? To be able to lump things. But as you said, it's a spectrum. And the further up you go towards ionizing, the higher and higher the energy, which means the faster and faster it can cause damage, which is, and I think most people are kind of aware of ultraviolet light being problematic for skin in terms of overexposure. And so, and of course, and the relationship with skin cancer. Interestingly enough, there's evidence around wireless radiation from cell phones and devices also contributing to skin cancer, and even just general artificial light as well. And so it is more about, I think, being mindful of the risks and then modifying your behavior where you can. Now, certainly you don't want to live near a cell phone tower, and we'll talk about one of the challenges with the potential rollout of 5G being the proximity of the antennas. But at the moment, most people will have much more exposure inside their own homes. And so if it's all right with you, I'd love to talk about how people can modify their exposure in their own four walls first, and then perhaps talk about what they can do about cell phone towers.
Absolutely. And, I think this is a similar discussion about working your way up and down the aisles at supermarkets and Bunnings and personal care products. This can all seem very overwhelming and frightening, but the good news is by making responsible decisions, informed decisions, you can reduce the ill effects of all of these things by a significant amount. In the form of chemicals, it can be up to 80, 90+%. And I'm guessing we can do the same for EMF. So let's go with that, Amie.
Yes, absolutely. So I actually did create a course, funnily enough, called EMF Proof Your Home. And in it, I say reduce your exposure by 95% in 4 weeks.
Great.
And I think, that's a significant amount. And that sort of covers a number of different types of EMFs. But I think probably the most important one to talk about is wireless radiation, because that's the one that is increasing at a hugely rapid rate, and is the one that we probably have the closest proximity to 24 hours a day, if judging the way people nurse their cell phones on the streets is. Yeah. So I want you to sort of think about all of the things in your home that are labelled smart or wireless run off wireless radiation. And basically, if it works without being plugged into the wall, it's wireless. Or if you can access it without an Ethernet cable, it's wireless. And anything that uses Bluetooth technology as well. So the two biggest things in people's homes will be the cell phones and the Wi-Fi modem. Now, obviously with your phone, it's a mobile phone, and when you're carrying it around with you because you're going mobile, you can't plug it in. So what I would say is, unless your job requires you to be on call, if you're carrying it around with you, whether it's in your pocket or your handbag, put it on flight mode and make sure that the Wi-Fi and the Bluetooth and the cellular data is all off. Now, you can also buy little bags or RFID protecting sleeves, which act as a mini Faraday cage. So if that's easier and more convenient, you can slip it into a Faraday cage and then slip it into your pocket or your handbag. But you do not want to be carrying your cell phone on your person.
Faraday cages, just give us a quick 101 Faraday cages.
Okay, so a Faraday cage is a term that's used where you create an environment that completely encapsulates something electrically speaking. Mm-hmm. And so there are certain metals that can do that. And certainly this is where the term tinfoil hat comes from. Tinfoil is no longer tinfoil, it's aluminium foil, which is actually quite conductive and doesn't work the same way. But tin is a very strong repellent of wireless radiation. So is steel. So if you were to make a little steel box and pop your cell phone in that and it was completely sealed, the cell phone wouldn't work and it wouldn't emit a signal and it wouldn't be able to receive a call. That being said, you can buy much more stylish and convenient Faraday cages now, which are usually leather, vegan leather or fabric that has been lined with either silver or copper thread and or some other metal. Sometimes it's tin, and that will actually reflect any wireless transmissions coming in and also create a bubble around any wireless transmissions that are coming out of the phone, effectively rendering it off-grid.
Right.
And so what that means is you can carry it in your handbag or in your pocket without it emitting radiation into your body. And anytime you pull it out, you can then instantly use it the way that you normally would. So that's what I would do if you're running around, you're in the car, you're walking the shops, you're out to lunch with a friend, babysitting your grandkids, and then you can periodically take it out, allow it to connect and check if you've had any calls, voicemails or text messages. Now, if your job requires you to have phone access all the time, obviously that's not going to be a practical intervention and you can just park that. But for everybody else, that is one significant and important way of reducing your exposure. The other thing is when you're at home, I don't know about you, Ron, but I know an awful lot of people that will sit on the couch with the telly on who will also be sitting on their phones scrolling away, whether it's checking out the gram, doing their shopping, clearing emails. You know, there's usually a couple of screens going and they're actually holding that cell phone in the proximity of all of their vital organs. And we know that it causes cardiovascular problems, damages the microbiome of the gut, causes DNA damage, and does a whole host of other things. So this is what I do. I actually hardwire my phone. I do the same thing with my laptop. And what that means is actually connecting an Ethernet cable from your modem and using a little gadget like this. Mm-hmm. This one is a Lightning to Ethernet adapter specific for iPhones and iPads and even iPods, and then switching off the wireless component in the modem. We'll talk about that in a second, and also on your phone. So you're basically hardwired into the internet, but you're not being exposed to any wireless radiation. Now, because I know this is how people use their phones, this is probably one of the most significant and easy, simple ways to reduce a really large exposure to the body.
So Amie, this is It plugs into the iPhone, and you take the blue cable that is doing not Wi-Fi through your house, but Ethernet blue cable, and plug it into your phone.
Correct.
And switch off Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, and just go cellular data still on?
No, keep the cellular data off as well. Yes.
So so that'll still work.
Yes, it will.
Okay, that's a really good one. I hadn't heard that.
Yeah. Well, so that I think is, given that most people, when they relax, will sit down with their phone and have it, in arm's reach, that is probably one of the best things someone could do. So that, of an evening when you're on the couch for, I don't know, some people 3 or 4 hours, after dinner, that's 3 or 4 hours of radiation exposure that you can avoid. I guess the other one is the wireless radiation from the modem. Now, there'll be certain things that, you'll need your Wi-Fi on for, especially if, let's say, you're making, a Zoom call or a Skype call and you've got to move around the house, you've got to do other stuff. Unless you have a very long cable like I do, you're going to need to connect to the Wi-Fi. But switching the Wi-Fi off when you're not using it and using the Ethernet cable while you can is another powerful way of reducing your exposure. So, for example, I've got a laptop. That's what I work on. And if I'm, down at the cafe, of course, I'm going to have to hotspot off my phone or connect to the cafe's wireless. But when I'm at home, which is usually 8 hours a day working on my laptop, I don't need to be exposing myself to that. I just plug in, again, using an adapter via the blue Ethernet cable. So again, I've nixed that whole exposure. Now, I have some clients that, it's a bit tricky to do that. There might be a share house, it might be 3 or 4 people. Not everyone wants to be sort of anchored down by an Ethernet cable. I understand that. Now, if that's the situation you find yourself in, at the very least, you can turn the Wi-Fi modem off at night. There is absolutely no need to be sleeping in non-ionizing radiation for 8 hours or so when the internet is not in use. So at the very least, turning it off when the last person goes to bed and then switching it back on when the first person who needs it is up in the morning. But hardwiring is obviously ideal. The other thing you can do, and this requires a little bit of extra support, is actually powering down the signal strength on your modem. Now, modems were originally a business device, and so the signal strength is very strong and was originally intended to be able to service a whole office floor with uninterrupted access. However, you don't need that kind of strength in a residential environment unless you live in some, 5-story mega mansion in Vaucluse. Maybe then you do. But for the average household, you can power down the signal by 95% and still have enough of a strong connection to be able to do everything you want, but you've dramatically lowered the amount of wireless radiation you're being exposed to. So that would be another tip that I would recommend.
So this is like signals coming in my case, I've got a cable connected to the modem. So that's how it actually gets its information. So it's the power's coming in, but then I have control over the signal going out on that modem. I'll have to go and I might just pause here and go to where my modem is while I play around. No, I'm not going to do that. But I mean, there is clearly buttons on there which says output, and you go the lower output. You can adjust it.
So what it is you've got to log into the ISP mainframe. So, for example, I've got NBN, but then so the NBN comes to the NBN box in my house, and then it delivers the signal to the modem. And then the modem can obviously emit a wireless connection, and you can also hardwire, and you can use one or the other or both at the same time. To change the strength of the signal in the modem, I'm with Vodafone. So I've got to log into my Vodafone account and do it through that. And so if you're with Telstra or Optus
Yeah.
or whoever you're with, you'll log into your account, and you might need to get their technical support to help you do this,
Right.
but you can reduce the signal strength from there. The other thing to be mindful of is a lot of the newer modems have also got cellular backup. Mine does, which means if the signal is low, it'll switch to cellular data. That has a button that you can turn off, and I would recommend you do that as well. Only turn it on if you need it, but otherwise that's going to be going as well. So as you can see, there's a lot of wireless, radiation coming out of those things that is just unnecessary unless you specifically want or need it for a given occasion.
It's just so interesting, isn't it? I mean, I've often thought that our relationship with technology is akin to a kid in a toy shop. We are so, and I'm guilty of this too. I'm not, we are so swept up in this new toy, and it's only been around since really smartphones since 2007. So it's relatively new, 14 years now. And we are loving it. I mean, we're getting all sorts of access. And now how exciting, we're going to be able to download movies even quicker, da-da-da-da-da. But the point is, there are these other issues about our health, and we kind of need to redefine our relationship with technology. And this is another reminder of that. And we won't today we won't go into the psychological and social implications of our relationship with technology. That's a discussion for another time. But this is another good example of really getting to know our technology and how to manage it well. And some of the things you've mentioned to me here, and I feel like I'm reasonably well informed. This is new. This is good. This is great, Amie. Do go on.
So, all right, excellent. So the other thing, of course, is to reevaluate your use of anything that's wireless or runs on Bluetooth. So to give you an example, I've got a Bose speaker upstairs that I can connect to either via an auxiliary cable, so actually plug it into my phone, or via Bluetooth. And so, if we've gone out for a dinner on the balcony, for example, of course I'm going to use the Bluetooth. I don't have an auxiliary cable that long, but I'll make sure that the speaker is, not on the table with us where we're eating. It's far enough away. But generally speaking, if I'm playing it in the kitchen, I will keep the Bluetooth part of it off and just use the auxiliary cable. Now, unfortunately, with some of the more newest sort of Bluetooth wireless devices, it's actually not possible to switch off the wireless component. A colleague of mine who's a building biologist has another Bose speaker that you can't. So she actually has to put it inside a stainless steel pot with the lid on at night, because otherwise it just continues to emit wireless radiation that she can't switch off. So it's same with things like headphones. Again, switching to a wired headset is better. Switching to air tubes is best, where the wire doesn't come all the way up and into your ears. Now, again, it depends what you're using them for. An air tube, for example, is perfect for conversations and phone calls, but the sound quality isn't great if you're listening to it for music. So maybe what you might choose to do is, instead of using, those fancy wireless headphones that have great sound for everything you do with your phone, just keep it for the music and watch how long you're using it, for example. So, anything like that. The other thing is, of course, how long you're being exposed to it, how close it is to your body, all of those things matter. So, a smart TV is a lot less problematic usually than your cell phone. Now, you won't necessarily know unless you measure, because every device is different, but because the TV is usually up on the wall a good 4 or 5 meters away from you, it's not the same as sitting there with your cell phone on your belly.
Now distance is important, isn't it? I mean, people go to sleep, and some people think they're being really good by going to sleep with they're sitting in bed with their laptop in their lap, or their phone under their pillow, or something by their bed. Distance is important. What's a safe distance?
Well, look, that does depend on the signal strength and the device. And of course, many people have multiple devices in their homes. So a building biologist or EMF field testing technician can come in and actually measure the overall exposure and identify where those sources are. For example, so I'm studying to be an EMF field testing technician, and we did an audit on a home where we were picking up a wireless signal from someone's cordless phone on the other side of the wall in the neighbor's house. And so, you can obviously modify what's happening in your home with your devices and measure that easily, but without professional equipment, some of those other external sources can be tricky to pick up. So the key thing, I think, is again, your exposure is always going to be greatest from your own devices, and distance is key. And distance wherever you sit, stand, or sleep for a long period of time is going to be the most important thing that you can do, especially the bedroom. So, what you said before prompted me to say, you don't want any devices in your bedroom at night. And ideally, everything should be off or in flight mode overnight while you're sleeping. I actually had a client many years ago, before I was even that well educated on the subject, who was waking up with headaches every morning. And she didn't come to see me for that. She'd come to see me for a nutrition program. She was a gymnast. She was going to compete the Olympics. And obviously in the case history, we uncovered she was waking up with headaches every morning. What she was doing was she was slipping her cell phone under her pillow, not in flight mode, and sleeping on it. And there are probably a lot of people who do that because they're, addicted to their devices and don't want to be disconnected from this virtual world. And of course, that's the fast highway to a brain tumor. That there's no beating around the bush about that. But of course, our brains being an electrical, super biological computer, it is one of our organs that is most vulnerable to electrical interference, if I can simplify it that much. And of course, as soon as I raised that with her, and I don't think she was prepared to not have it in the bedroom, but she would put it in flight mode and leave it on the bedside table and didn't charge it. That's another really important one. The magnetic field's a problem. Instant headache disappearance. Wow. She no longer had those problems. Yeah, it can be really that simple.
Yes. Wow, that's so profound, isn't it? Because a lot of people are doing just that, and actually, ironically, monitoring their sleep quality by using devices like that, and that's a whole story in itself. And then you mentioned also that some people are actually very sensitive to this. It's a condition that's becoming recognised, isn't it? EMF hypersensitivity. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. So look, EMFs are going to cause cellular damage to all human beings and all living beings, actually. And it's that latency period and a matter of time. And if your exposure is high enough and lengthy enough, you'll likely develop what's called electrohypersensitivity. Electrohypersensitivity, though, can be induced when your body has been through some other burden. I actually developed what I would consider to be a mild form of that as a result of SIRS and my mold exposure. So if you have any sort of chronic inflammation or autoimmune condition or any other immunological disorder or cellular weakness, mitochondrial dysfunction, you're much more vulnerable because your reserves are less and your ability to weather biological challenges is also weaker. And so it can look different for everyone. I will run through the symptoms in a moment, but I'll just share my personal symptoms because I didn't get a lot of those that are on the list, and it took me a while to work out what it was. So the year that I got sick with mold, of course, I was using Wi-Fi because everyone does, and I didn't know any better. And the Wi-Fi modem, whilst it was in a different room, it still was only about 5 meters away. So exposure number one. I also got myself a really fancy, pretty looking white cordless phone to sit on my desk, which was, 1.5 feet away from my face. I then also have a stand that my cell phone sits on that's 1 foot away from my face and my laptop right there. So I was sitting in a sea of wireless radiation. And of course, my body was burdened by mycotoxins. And what was happening was my face would start to go numb, my nose in particular. It was like a little bit like when you get an anesthetic from the dentist, you know how your face goes numb. And then as it begins to wear off, you get that sort of, you've got some sensation, but it feels very muted and dull and puffy and distant. And it was that sort of, I can feel my nose, but it also feels like I've got anesthetic wearing off. And that would sort of spread to my face. If I was sitting on my cell phone for a while, my hand would get the same kind of numb, puffy sort of feeling. I would also get a bit of a headache, and it's a very distinctive headache. It's not like a hangover. It's not like a normal migraine. It's like a brain ache that I know I then eventually worked out was specific to my cell phone. I would also start getting palpitations, so sort of funny arrhythmias. I'd feel my heart sort of do weird things in my chest. And I would also, if I kept pushing, which I don't, but of course, back then when I didn't know any better, if I just kept exposing myself, I'd end up feeling really sick. It wasn't like a food poisoning nausea, but it was, I guess, more of a milder feeling of, I feel ill and I may vomit. I don't think I'm going to, but would I feel better if I did? So they were my symptoms, and they're the same symptoms I get if I am, which doesn't happen very often these days, but occasionally, you know, if I'm traveling, for instance, and I'm not hardwired, I will get, because I run my own business online. But some of the other symptoms that you can get with electrohypersensitivity, headache's probably the most common one. That happens in almost 90% of people who consider themselves sensitive. Abnormal sensations, like the ones that I got, are also quite common in over 80% of people, but it might not necessarily be numbness. It could be burning, prickling, or aching feelings. Weirdly, muscle aches and pains occur in roughly half of people who are sensitive to EMFs. So that might look like fibromyalgia, or it might just look like general aches and pains or joint pains. For people who make the mistake of talking with their cell phones up to their head, hot ears or ear pain is very common, or a headache on that side. Same with tinnitus, so ringing, buzzing, crackling in the ear. But it can really affect people's moods. So attention deficit can occur, dizziness, loss of immediate memory, anxiety, depression, things like that.
Amie, wow, we've just covered so much territory here, and you know, when we first met, you were giving a lecture in one of the conferences that we'd attended, and I think your teaching is fabulous. And you mentioned you have a course on this, and it's a great opportunity for people. We're going to have links to that course, because this is just a big topic which people need to get their head around, because it's part of our lives and it's not going away.
That's right.
And so I will definitely, we're going to have links to this, to your course, because and I think I'm going to go and do it myself. So I really want to thank you for today to raise this issue, because as I said, it's something that we're all confronted with. So thank you again for joining us and sharing your wisdom, and I'm looking forward to doing the course.
My absolute pleasure, Ron. Thanks for having me.
Well, with knowledge comes power, and having the knowledge about how to minimise your exposure to EMR, electromagnetic radiation, is a significant part of dealing with this issue. And as I say, have said many times, considering that every cell in our body, every atom in our body is both energy and matter, to assume that electromagnetic radiation, whether it be in the form of mobile phones, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, whatever, to assume that that has no effect is naive at best and perhaps negligent at worst. So I think the precautionary principle is a really good way to proceed with so many of these issues, that if we are unsure about its effect, we should assume that we should be cautious about it. And I'd say putting a distance between us is a very important part of that, and being aware of where it's coming from is also, important. Now, Amie Skilton's website, we will have links to, and she has an online program and she's offering a discount on that program, EMF in the home and how to avoid its harmful effects. There's a code that you can put in, unstress. We'll have links to that in the show notes, and we'll have links to Amie's website as well. Now, we've got some great things happening in our courses, and we've got a great online 5 Pillars of Health course coming. We're just switching over to a whole new platform, which is going to make it a lot easier to access the information and interact with it. And we're also developing the app, not just the Unstress with Dr. Ron app, but the 5 Pillars of Health app, which will literally put health and wellness in the palm of your hand. So, and of course, do not forget to leave a review on iTunes. Have to put in that plug as well. I hope this finds you well. So until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.